Hello, this is reporter Julie Spencer, and I'd like to welcome you to Newsline Iowa City. Please join me today as we talk about recent political trends with Nicholas Johnson, University of Iowa law professor. He is perhaps best known for his term as commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, during which he was featured on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine and published How to Talk Back to Your Television Set. He also served as a presidential advisor for Jimmy Carter for the White House Conference on Library and Information Services. Can you comment on Trump's tough immigration policy?
Well, if we didn't have immigrants, I wouldn't be here. Both grandfathers and grandmothers on both sides of my family were immigrants. On my father's side from Sweden, on my mother's side from an area that sometimes is German and sometimes is Danish. And then there were my parents, and then there's me. So I'm not that far from being an immigrant myself. In fact, the only true Americans are Americans with American ancestors are my friends at the Meskwaki settlement and other Native Americans throughout the United States. The rest of us all came over, whether we were shackled in a slave ship and brought over here against our will, or whether we came over here to seek a better life. So I think we need to have a little recognition and humility about going after immigrants. Now, I do think that a nation has a right to protect itself from people who have a demonstrated record of wanting to do harm to our country. But I do think that our emphasis on violence in America caused by recent immigrants really needs to be examined. There are 1,000 times more people who die from guns in this country that are wielded by non-immigrants, or die in automobile accidents, or die from continued use of tobacco, than die from an act by a recent immigrant who does a violent act here. And you can even include 9/11 in that. I mean, that was a terrible thing. There's no question about that. It called for some response. And that's 3,000 people. We kill over 30,000 people in automobile deaths every year. So is it a problem? Yeah. And it ranks right up there with preventing people from suffering from lightning strikes. If you're concerned about dead Americans, it's not really a serious problem. And if you're concerned about violent, deliberate deaths, well, first off, it's the handgun problem. But when you get to these individual mass shootings and so forth, more of those are committed by non-immigrants, probably of the Christian faith, I don't make that an argument, than are committed by people who are recent immigrants of the Muslim faith. Most recent one in Texas, not far from where I went to college. He was not a Muslim. He was not a recent immigrant. The shootings in Las Vegas, I believe, I'm not as sure of my facts on that one. So I think it's a little crazy. Now, to control population, I think that's another issue. I think every nation has a responsibility to take some immigrants from Syria, from South Sudan, particularly countries where we've created the problem. We've created a lot of the problem in the Middle East. We've saved those who want to do us harm from having to buy airfare to come over here. We send soldiers over there, and not necessarily welcome. And they certainly make good targets because they all wear uniforms. So that I think a case can be made, if we hadn't gone over there in the first place, we wouldn't have had a lot of the organized terrorism that we now have, which is based on a response to American presence there. But I'm wandering far afield from your question.
Do you see any credible evidence for the possibility of impeachment of our president?
Well, I think it's a little early to be talking about impeachment until we have more of Mueller's investigation on its way. In fact, we're going to be talking about that very issue in this room at a seminar, noon seminar this Friday. What possible legal theories are there and so forth. Just strictly as not as a partisan thing, but as a bunch of law professors often in their with their legal theories. I think it's superficially, based on what we now do know, there's a lot of indication that there were many connections between the Trump administration and campaign and Putin's Russia, and the oligarchs who were part of his circle, and so forth. And more of that evidence just keeps coming out every day. Much of that involves, as Deep Throat said in the Watergate matter, follow the money. I mean, during the campaign, Trump had somebody in Moscow trying still to make arrangements to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. One of his sons acknowledged that most of the people putting money in the condos of theirs in New York were from Russia. It was either the Times or the Post that had a story recently about the 9 people who, during the course of the campaign, had meetings with Russians, virtually all of whom had earlier denied any such thing and are now shown to have misrepresented. Well, if you misrepresent something that you did, you know, why, if it's totally innocent, did you misrepresent it? But none of what I've just said constitutes a legal case or a case for impeachment. It's not against the law for an American to have an investment in the Soviet Union. I gather that everything the Secretary of Commerce did, running money through the Cyprus Bank, being on that board, knowing that that's the bank that was the favored bank by Russian oligarchs, and he's a part of that operation. Apparently there was nothing there that actually was a violation of law. Or his sitting on the board of the corporation that, I think the way it worked out, there was, I think it was Putin's son-in-law maybe, or his son, who had this business, maybe it was an oil business, and then the Secretary of Commerce was on the board of a corporation, was providing shipping services to them. I may have that wrong, but it's something like that. And apparently there's nothing there that is illegal on its face. And how do you show collusion? Well, for starters, there's nothing in the U.S. Code we've got a copy of in here. You can't find anything in there about collusion being a crime. And how would you prove it? Well, it seems to me there's some evidence of it when you go to a meeting with Trump campaign officials and Russians where it's represented they're going to give them some dirt on Hillary, and where they are going to ask for a relaxation on some of the conditions that have been put on Russia. Kind of looks like a quid pro quo. It kind of looks like they're working together. Then there's the question of how would the Russians have been able to get a hold of information about the individual precincts that were most important in Wisconsin. That's a level of knowledge that's pretty hard to find in a public library in Moscow. So there are a lot of things that certainly don't look good. The denials, what the acting attorney general told the Trump campaign with regard to Flynn, and the failure of the Trump administration do anything about it until it appeared in the papers. Attorney General saying that he never met with any Russians and he didn't know of anybody who did. And then you've got a picture of him sitting in a meeting. I mean, all that really looks bad. But until Mueller has finished his investigation and comes up with some kind of a report, then you have the issue of what is a Republican-controlled House of Representatives going to do. True impeachment is a two-step process. The House brings the charge of an impeachable offense, and then the trial is held in the Senate. Well, so far, the chairman of the House Investigations Committee has totally indicated his support for Trump and unwillingness to do anything that would be critical. Based on the results in Virginia last night, other states' legislatures end up going Democratic and regaining some of the over 1,000 legislative seats the Democratic Party has lost over the last few years. And you get some of these gerrymandered districts made districting more like we do it here in Iowa, and you have more have Democratic control of the House, which under the present situation would be unlikely. But if that were to happen, well, then maybe an impeachment's possible. Or you look back at what the Republicans found an adequate impeachable offense with Bill Clinton, and it looks like a little kindergarten spat, compared to all the things that Trump's at least alleged to have possible. If those things turn out to be true, that's a big if, it really would look bad for the Republicans to say, that's okay. Oh, boys will be boys. We don't think we should impeach Trump. Because they are fearful of getting a primary challenge and having to confront within the Republican primary a pro-Trump candidate who might actually turn them out of office. And therefore, they don't want to be allied with people who are trying to impeach Trump. So whether it'll ever happen is another question altogether. But and whether it should happen requires, I think, more information than we now have.
Can you comment about the status of race relations in America today?
Well, I think we have to confront the fact that we have had, since the first slaves were brought over here, a problem of race relations, as you put it. And much of the problem is systemic. We had a speaker here earlier this week on that very subject. But there's so much data and studies that have been done of you have two job applicants, they're fictional, but you make up these resumes, identical resumes. And one has a name that people might associate with African American and the other not. And who gets the calls back for the interview? And that's what we mean by systemic racism. The person doing it may very well be unconscious that that's what they're doing. You have the same thing in housing. There'll be an available apartment or house, and you'll send a white person and an African American or Hispanic to see the house, and a minority person arrives first, and they're told, oh, we're sorry, this has already been sold or already been rented. And then the white person shows up and no, it hasn't been rented. Or the redlining on housing that was done by banks. They would not give loans to African Americans to buy a house, even though they had the money, in areas that were set aside for whites. Or the way the school districts work all the way across the country. It's the Brown against Board of Education. We're not supposed to have segregation in our schools. You look around, even Iowa City, but I mean, the cities all across the country. And because of the way in which the housing works, and because of the way in which we tend to have so-called neighborhood schools, we end up with a lot of segregation in the schools. We had initially problems with the military. The military adjusted relatively well, I must say, and they did also adjust relatively well to GLBT. We had actually the law school I went to, University of Texas, only a couple of years earlier had a Supreme Court case, Sweat versus Painter, that integrated that law school. It was a white-only law school under the law and practices of Texas. When I was down there during the 50s, that was the tag end of Jim Crow, but it was sure there. I mean, there was East Austin and West Austin, and there were white and black water fountains and restrooms and movie theaters where African Americans couldn't go and so forth. So I witnessed it down there, and the judge I was clerking for having crosses burned in their lawns because they were really pro-civil rights and writing some very courageous opinions for the 1950s. While it was painful to see, I think it was useful for me as an Iowa boy to have that experience. But I talk about Iowa boy. In the 1930s, African Americans in Iowa City couldn't find housing here. The barbershops wouldn't cut their hair. We had to, and look at the faculty at that time in the 20s and 30s. How many women professors were there? How many African American professors? How many Jewish professors did we have at the University of Iowa during the 20s and 30s? So that's what I mean by systemic racism. Now, in addition to that, we have the extremes. The people the guy that went into a black church and mowed down people, just killed them, or the blowing up of the church, bombing of the church, and the acts of overt violence and the lynching that went on during the 19th and 20th century. Now, of course, the police shootings disproportionately pulling over people accused of driving while black, as we call it, knock out the rear light and then say they pulled them over because they had a broken taillight, and searching where otherwise they wouldn't have searched. And so you've got these problems, in addition to which you have the really overt, blatant, spray painting of offensive things, or writing in restrooms, or expletives that are shouted out and so forth that they have to put up with. Make an effort to do something about it, but it doesn't seem to be all. We made progress, and I think most African Americans would acknowledge that it's a lot better in 2017 than it was in 1917. That's true, but we've still got so much farther to go.
And my last question, what trends do you see going into the future?
Well, there are trends with regard to all kinds of things.
Political trends.
Oh, political trends,
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're on the cusp of going either direction. We just had a city council election, 15% of the people in Iowa City turned out to vote. I think that unless more people take an interest in government, more people, I think we have an issue with media that is related to this, in terms of one of our local papers that has now been so decimated by its owner that it's not really in a position to give us the information we need about what's going on in our community. I don't blame the local people who are with that paper. It's not their fault. It's their conglomerate owner squeezing them. But we must have abundant and quality factual reporting on the challenges that we confront in our local communities. You've asked me about racism, the disparity in income, challenges of education, of transportation, of housing, and so forth. Those stories need to be in the papers. And there's another local paper that does a relatively good job of that, given the resources that they have available to them. That's absolutely essential. And what we're teaching our kids in the schools about political participation. You know, we want to judge our kids based on their test scores and so forth. How about taking a list of the graduates from City High and West High, and 5 years after they've graduated, look and see how many of them are registered to vote. How many of them do vote in city council elections and school board elections. All right? That's a measure of how well you're teaching government, civics, whatever you call it, if you are still teaching what we used to call civics, which was one of the original 19th century purposes for having K-12 education. If we don't do what we need to do with regard to education and making it easier for people to vote and educating them properly and providing them the information they need about their local community, not to mention the state and the nation and the world, from their local media, and that they have an interest in curiosity and learning that and then acting on it. If we do that, I think we have a prayer of maybe within a generation overcoming what Trump has done to us and what 40% of the American people have essentially asked him to do, and turning that around and bringing us back to the kind of patriotism and participation we had during the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s and early 70s. I think we can make America that kind of great again, but it is going to be one terrible struggle. It was struggle enough before Trump ever appeared on the scene, and he's done nothing but make it worse and worse and worse and worse with regard to all of these pillars of a democracy. So the other path we might follow is the path we're now on, leading to more authoritarian oligarchs, dictators, surveillance of the American people, a dumbing down of the media and the schools, creating more and more lack of respect for, even anger at the mass media that are left and are trying to do a job, more and more support for the great leader. That we have plenty of history on how that process works, and we're going right down that path. There's no question about that. We are in the beginning stages of what other historic dictators have done. I won't name them because I don't want to characterize Trump in that way, but we're certainly at the early stages of that. So if we do nothing, that's the path we will continue to follow. And if Trump does not serve a second term and then get the law changed so that he can serve beyond 2 terms, get the Constitution changed, which he would probably be able to do if we continue on this path, and then we have him forever. But if we don't have him forever and he only serves 2 terms, then we're going to have another one just like him, because that's how you win elections in America at that point. And I just think that is such a terrible and dangerous, and I fear for my kids and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren now. I'm of that age. I don't really see right now the strength in the Democratic Party to turn that around. I see apprehension in the Republican Party about not appearing to be supportive of Trump. So I don't quite see where, and the media is decimated and is now thought by the Trump 40% as being all fake news and people who hate America and so forth. So I don't hold out a lot of hope, I'm sorry to say. I wish I could. The potential is there, as I described, what we have to do to go the other path. And the question is, how many of us are willing to do that?
Do you see the American people rising up?
That is the question. Will we? I don't now see that. No, I do not. And I do not see a path to that being created.
Why is that?
Well, I think you need an organized mass of people to do it. And the Democratic Party would be in a position to do it, but it's been so wedded to Wall Street and the major donors, and it's really turned its back on people in abject poverty, people who are poor, the working class, the trade unions, essentially the bottom 80% economically of this country. If the Democratic Party had continued with the base that it had during the 30s and 40s and actually talked to those people, went to visit them, continued knocking on doors and getting to know their neighbors, advocating on their behalf, producing results on their behalf, they would today, I mean, it's 80% of the American people, they would today win every election, from school board and the courthouse to the White House. Hands down, they'd win everything. But they've taken the path of saying what's most important is to raise $100 million, $1 billion, whatever it takes, to buy the television time to reach people indirectly through television and social media. And we're not going to have this personal contact anymore. That's the problem. Democrats could do it, but they weren't willing to do it with Bernie Sanders. I mean, consider this. Here's a guy from Brooklyn who's moved to Vermont. He has no national following. He has no collection of major donors. He's an avowed socialist. And he goes out there and raises the money, $27 a contribution, enough to match Hillary Clinton and do a very substantial job of running against her, coming from nothing. And she has the full backing of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic leadership is overtly opposed to Bernie Sanders. The media wouldn't put him on the air, and he had that support. They turn their back on that. They turn their back on that, and they lose. Of course they lose. Because if somebody wants to go with what the Republicans are advocating, why go for Republican light? Why not vote for the Republican? And if those are the people you're appealing to, you ain't going to win, because more of them are going to look at you and your ties to big business and big donors and billionaires and Wall Street, and they're going to say, well, shoot, if that's what I want, I think I'm going to have a better shot at getting that from a Republican than I will from a Democrat. And so they turn their back on their natural constituency, and they can't appeal to the other constituency, and so they lose elections. It seems to me pretty simple, but apparently it's much more complex than I understand.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking with me. It's very informative. I've enjoyed it greatly.
Well, I've enjoyed it too, and I thank you for the invitation.